Hello, everyone, and welcome to Educative Sessions, a podcast series with people in the developer world about their coding experiences. This is brought to you by Educative, which makes it easy for authors to provide interactive and adaptive courses for software developers. My name is Lingo, and I am the host of Educative Sessions. Today, my guest is Swizec Teller, who is going to talk about his journey from Eastern Europe to leading coding teams in Silicon Valley. Swizec, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the very beginnings of your career. Like, where were you originally based, and what were your first tech jobs like?
Right. So I'm originally from Slovenia, which is a tiny little country between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you can tell, but that's become kind of my spiel because nobody knows where Slovenia actually is. Um,
I've always
and
known.
like,
I mean, well,
really?
I'm
Okay.
a bit of a geography wonk. So, like,
Okay.
I mean, part of
Okay.
the former Yugoslavia,
Hmm.
and then I believe one of my favorite pop scholars, Slavoj Žižek's from Slovenia, right?
Yeah, that's
Hey,
true.
hey.
Everyone recognizes Slavoj Žižek.
There you go.
Um,
Very cool.
he's not actually as famous in the country as he is outside the country.
That tends to happen quite often.
Yeah.
Very cool. So you
Um,
were in Slovenia, yeah?
yeah, so I'm in Slovenia and I actually got really lucky. I started coding when I was in elementary school.
Well,
I happened to be going to the only elementary school or one of the few elementary schools that had a coding class. This was in the mid 90s, so pretty rare back then. And I kind of really fell in love with that. So then, as soon as I hit 15 years old, I had to be able to allow to be allowed to work for money.
mhm.
I started getting internships over the summer at just any company that would take me. So, like one of my first jobs was building some weird PHP stuff for the local nuclear power plant.
Hmm.
Uh, they weren't directly my client. I was just an intern for somebody for whom they were a client, and they're like, "Yeah, sure, you can write this code."
Hmm.
Um, I don't know
I'm
if
just
that ever hit
wondering,
production.
building things in PhD for a nuclear power plant. That I want to know
I
more.
know,
Like,
right?
well, how did that
Yeah.
work
So
out? Right?
I think in theory it was like a UI for some data management or
Hmm.
something like that. I don't think it was running the actual nuclear power plant.
Hmm.
But this was also a while ago, so I don't remember everything.
Hmm.
Um, I know that back then I was already working from home, which was, I guess, kind of weird. But what threw me for a loop the most was they gave me some data to process, and I was like, "Well, it's working." And I gave them the code, and they ran different data through it, and it's like, "No, it's not working." I'm like, what do you mean it's not working? And this was like before I really understood the concept of test data and real data,
Hmm.
and I made it work really well for the test data, which wasn't the same as the real data, so
Hmm.
everything stopped working.
Awesome.
Um, yeah, so those were fun times. But
Right.
then
Right.
eventually I got into a web agency. I worked there building websites. For that agency, I was the only technical person on the team. So I would get PDFs from designers, translate them to websites for clients. And yeah, from there, what happened next? I launched a startup in college. Then after that startup crashed and burned, I started freelancing for Silicon Valley companies.
Hmm.
I was like, well, I've heard all these great things about Silicon Valley, and I'm here in Europe doing basically the same work. I want to get paid as much as those guys are getting paid. So I kind of started working for Silicon Valley. And then by 2015, I was able to fully transition and start living in Silicon Valley full time.
Yeah.
Worked at a startup for a while, and then right right before the pandemic, or right at the beginning of the pandemic, I switched from that startup to a different startup, which is totally rocket shipping, and it's like the coolest experience I've ever had.
Sure. Sure. And so, how do you compare the experiences? You first came in. I presume maybe into working for a much more established company, but you've also worked for startups. And around what era of Silicon Valley
Mhm.
were you in at this time?
So I think I would classify my story as kind of non-traditional. My first trip to Silicon Valley was actually in, I think it was 2012.
Hmm.
looking for investments for my then startup.
Hmm.
And it was so cool. 2012 was kind of in the beginning of the iOS boom, I would say,
Yeah.
when mobile was becoming a thing. So it was really easy to get people excited because we were building an iPad app. And this would be, I think this was iPad Gen 1 had just come out 6 months before that. Um, and we were able to get people to say, yeah, we will totally lead you around. We're going to invest. And then because we were poor kids from Europe, we were like, well, our 2 weeks are up, we're out of money, and we went back home. Turns out it's very hard to keep in touch with Silicon Valley investors if you're not in the Bay Area.
Hmm.
Um, but then after that, with the freelancing, I ended up coming here in 2014, 2015. I was kind of living between both continents for a while. But I always worked for startups. I have never worked for a big established company.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. What's been, I identify very strongly with that because I would say, especially in the last 10 years for me personally, I've been in companies that either are startups, certainly,
Mhm.
startups I've created on my own, or are companies that are actually part of big companies, but they want to think like startups, right? So it's almost like everyone's really going for a certain kind of attitude towards things, a certain kind of
Mhm.
way of doing things. And today you wanted to talk a lot about mindsets, right?
Yep.
And I wanted to hone in a little bit more on what startup engineers in particular and the kind of mindsets that might be different because you've been, of course, to a
Mhm.
lot of different locations. What is the difference in your view of engineers who think in with like that kind of startup mentality?
Yeah. So that's kind of a deep question, probably deeper than it sounds at first.
Hmm.
And it's kind of hard to put into words in a way that makes sense to everyone because you talk to a lot of people who aren't in the startup ecosystem or especially people from other places than here. And the way they think about engineering is kind of rigid in a way. It's very, oh, you get these requirements and you have to make it perfect and you have to be really careful about all of the details and kind of almost over engineering everything. Whereas in a startup, it's a lot more, hey, we have to get it done first. And then if it works, we can make it perfect later, which is kind of almost inverted. There's this a mantra that you see a lot of engineers, especially on the internet, talk about is if you don't have time to build it right, what makes you think you're going to have time to build it twice? And actually, in the startup world, it's the exact inverse of that because
Hmm.
you don't have time to build it right because you will have time to build it twice later.
Hmm.
And this took me a really long time to grasp, but my former CTO, the moment it really clicked was he sat me down and he was like, look, Swizz, stop. Like, stop worrying so much about code quality. Stop thinking so much about all the edge cases and stuff. None of it is going to matter if we don't survive.
Hmm.
The company has to survive first. If it doesn't survive, nobody's going to see that code again. It doesn't matter how good it is because nobody's going to be using it. So in a startup, especially in a startup in those more earlier stages, you have to survive first. You have to prove that you have something that people actually want, that people are going to pay for, something that can be profitable at least eventually, if not right away. And then when you get there, then you can focus on making it perfect and on code quality and all those things.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this because this is the first time I think I'm hearing about how time is more plentiful, perhaps in the startup mentality, as opposed to getting to market. Maybe I've operated differently, but I've always felt like time is actually the scarcest resource of all in the startup
Mm-hmm.
world because you are, it's in a way, thinking about overall quality and thinking about like that. I've certainly heard that. That's, I mean, like there's no such thing as a perfect startup app. They're all
Mm-hmm.
the MVP or the minimally viable product has been a pervasive concept, and it certainly
Mm-hmm.
led to like bad code but good enough to get to market. But
Yep.
isn't I assume though there's got to be some that sense of time is still um, like there's still a sense of urgency, I want to say, among
Yeah.
startup engineers, right?
Yeah.
And amongst entrepreneurs in general, that
Mhm.
it's not necessarily about trying to get it perfect. It's really just trying to get it done. Um,
Yep.
so in a way, I'm asking, like, did you ever feel like you don't even have time to do it again? I mean, because like even that single shot might be the last shot too, right?
Yeah. So I think that's the main thing is you can think of startups as going in stages. The idea is you're working really fast right now to get it to a certain point, because when it's at a certain point, when you hit certain metrics, you can then get more money, and that gives you a longer timeline. So it's more like, rather than like in a startup, you would rather have an imperfect, barely working feature next week than the perfect version of that feature 2 months from now. And that's kind of what you're always optimizing for, because if you get the imperfect feature out in a week, you can then get feedback from the market. You can improve the feature. You can basically, it's all about getting fast feedback cycles as quickly as possible. The more feedback you can get, the quicker you can verify that what you're building is actually the right thing. And then once you've proven that you've built the right thing, you can get more money, more people, better experts who can then make it right. And in a lot of cases, like these days, I probably, maybe not these days, but a couple years back, when I was somewhere in the middle between proper startup mentality and not yet, I probably threw away more code than I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that has mostly changed now, because I find that I'm writing a lot less code, but the code I'm writing is more correct, is more right. So I'm much less likely to write code that I need to throw away, because I've internalized that I would rather write as little code as possible, make as simple of a system as possible that's just barely good enough, so that I then don't have to throw all of the code away when I realize, oh shit, we built the wrong feature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, and I wonder if that's what your concept of the senior mindset's really all about, right? And I find it's not. I mean, it's something that doesn't come naturally to be able to write efficiently, to almost
Mhm.
refactor in your head before you put something down, and then to create something with almost near optimization by the time you do it,
Mhm.
right? Um, does that come? Are there people that can be naturally in tune with that, or is that just part of the long tail process of becoming a developer? Is that you
Yeah.
learn how to do things better. You see optimization in your own messes when you're first kind of writing drafts. It's just like with writing, it's like it's very
Mhm.
rare that someone writes something like a novel or even like an essay that's brilliant the
Yeah.
first time around. It requires that. Can you speak to a little bit more about therefore the senior mindset and
Mhm.
how people are able to get there as quickly as possible?
Yeah. So I think the best way to summarize that is, if you if you remembered, or if you know of those IQ memes where it's like a normal distribution graph, and you have a person on the left who says, "Oh, like not a very smart developer." They're on the left and say a for loop is fine. Then you have super smart developers that are in the middle of the graph. They're like, "Oh, you need to use functional programming and visitor patterns and all of these architectures and make it complicated and perfect so that it's theoretically beautiful and amazing." And then at the end of the graph, like and it's really, I'm realizing it's really hard to explain memes verbally. At the end of the graph, you once more get to a for loop is fine. And I think that's kind of the cycle I went through as well in my career. When I was starting, I was like, I'm just going to write this the simplest way possible, because I don't know any other way to do it, or I'm not smart enough yet to know about all of these patterns. And then you get to a point where you discover all of these architectural patterns and uh, different syntaxes and beautiful, like really amazing things that sound really good in a textbook. And then you get older and wiser, and you're like, yeah, you know what? The simplest way possible is fine, because you end up optimizing your code for how easy it is to change rather than how perfect it is.
Mm,
And I see this a lot when I'm working with people as well. It's like
right.
textbook perfection versus, it's good enough.
Right. Well, first, I thought you did a fine job explaining that meme. And generally memes by default are not meant to be interpreted like they're not meant to be explained. They're meant to be contextually understood. And so you did a
Mhm.
fine job. Um, but second, I think that's a really good way. It's almost like the difference between intelligence and wisdom, one could
Mhm.
say, or that this is just like it's kind of cool, but also daunting in a sense that you can identify a experienced senior coder by the way they write code, right? You can actually,
Mhm.
like a lot of people say, show me your GitHub, let me see your script, and they can tell if you know how to properly refactor things or you know how to write logics in a certain way, or you're actually up to date on much more advanced things that take years to get to, right?
Mhm.
um, I don't want to sound like I'm discouraging younger coders or what have you. You know, I want to. It's almost like this is what it takes. This is what you're opting into as
Yeah.
a career, right? Do you have any, in a way, as you're, I mean, you know, seeing your own journey? Is there a way to even think of like, let's call them shortcuts, or maybe
Mhm.
place, or maybe on ramps, we'll call them that, to
Mhm.
for people who are hoping to attain this kind of a mindset, to be able to write in a way that's much more elegant than where they are now.
I think there are a lot of shortcuts that you can use, but I'm still figuring out how to actually teach them to people. It's especially if you go to college for coding, if you go study CS, or I don't know how it is in boot camps, but this was definitely a problem in CS, is that you're never writing code that you will ever have to maintain. So obviously you try to be fancy and you try to do all of your best things because you're kind of almost showing off for your professor.
Hmm.
And the quickest way to heal yourself of that, maybe not heal, but like the quickest way to get out of that is to build a project, put it on the shelf for 6 months, and then come back to it and try to add a new feature or fix it. And you will very quickly realize that, oh my God, all of this stuff that I wrote is completely ununderstandable 6 months later when I haven't been working with it every day. And kind of that maintenance, that having a long-term project that you're working on over time is probably the quickest way to learn, hey, maybe I should keep my code simple. Maybe I should really go for the most obvious solution. It's also like, I forget who said this, but there's a really good quote, something like, you have to write your, don't write clever code because you have to be smarter to debug your code than you were when you were writing it. So if you're writing at your cleverest, then how will you ever be smart enough to debug it?
There you
Um,
have it, right? Yeah, 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 yeah. Do you think it is a relational thing? Do you think it requires, um, like, you, it has to come through mentoring, or it has to come through working in a community, or just like failing and doing it over and over again, right?
mhm.
Uh, yeah, I'm wondering if they're, you know, just, it's almost just like for anybody that wants to become a better coder rather than just
Yep.
relies on, you know, the basics or what have you, just to kind of get things done. Um,
Mhm.
I'm going to say something bold and think like, well, there is a bit of a gap when it comes to, say, the duct tape ways of being in startup engineer world, where you're just trying to make it work, even if it's a
Mhm.
sloppy way to do so. But as long as it works, like, what is the incentive for people to therefore improve from that point, um, if it's not coming from the market?
So great question. I'm gonna answer the mentoring part first.
Okay.
I think go finding a mentor or working with someone who can help you out is definitely the fastest way because there is a lot of tacit knowledge in coding that is really hard to put in a textbook. And a lot of people that I've talked to even say this is just not teachable. You either have it or you don't have it, and potentially you can pick it up by osmosis. And that's where the mentoring comes in. I think this is where, for my career personally, I went the painful, slow way because for a long part of my beginning career, I was the only tech person on the team. I was the only engineer, or I was the most experienced engineer. That's a good way to learn. You get exposed to a lot of very interesting things, but you're also the one who's getting hit over the head with and banging your head against the wall trying to break through. Whereas if you have a mentor, you can bump your head against the wall once or twice, and then the mentor's like, hey, there's a door right there. And they show you how to open the door. And like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then it gets easier, right? Um, so you can simulate some of that by swallowing your pride and putting things out there in public and seeing how people react to them and getting feedback that way. I think people online are definitely going to be less nice about it than a real mentor would be. But it is one way to figure these things out. And again, you can kind of self-mentor by having long-term projects and realizing, hey, this thing that I did was great, but it doesn't really work over the long term. So next time I'm going to do it differently. And you can kind of go that way. And then the other part of the question with duct taping and why would you ever stop duct taping? Mm-hmm. It can actually kill companies if there's too much duct tape.
Right. I may know the answer already. Like we're thinking about technical debt and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So technical debt and things like that. This is not a book I've written yet, but I'm planning to write a book about how technical debt is okay and you should use it if you're using it wisely. Mm-hmm. But I think the canonical story about this, or the canonical blog post about this, is from Joel Spolsky from probably like 20 years ago now, where he described how Netscape, when they decided, oh God, Netscape codebase is terrible, we're going to stop this and we're going to make a new browser that's not as bad as Netscape. And I think that's how Firefox was born and Mozilla. Mm-hmm. And that was the moment that they lost market leadership. They were the single best, most popular browser in the world. And because of that decision to rewrite, they were overtaken by Internet Explorer. Mm. And I've heard that even these days, if you go dig into Firefox code, you will still find bits and pieces that are from Netscape times and use like NS something something in their names. Mm. So where was I going with this? This is like a very large project. The scales are completely different than what most of us would ever experience. I think. But even in my current startup, we have a piece of code or a system that was built in very slapdash manner. I think they launched a feature that has, I don't know how much of it I can say without stepping on too many toes. But basically, there's a feature that is big enough that there are entire companies whose entire raison d'etre is that feature. All they ever do is build that feature. And our startup engineers back in the early days were able to launch the whole thing in a week from scratch. So amazing engineers, right? They built this whole thing that usually takes an entire company in a week. And it's still working. It's still in production. It's doing amazingly. It's just that anytime we want to make a change, the whole engineering team runs away crying and saying, no, we don't want to touch that. Can we go do anything else in the world? Please make us do anything, absolutely anything else except fixing that code. Nobody wants to fix that code. Nobody understands that code. And it's starting to slow us down. We now have features where if we could just fix that part of the code base, make that feature a little easier to work with, there are entire other features that we could deliver to market that could make our metrics better, that could make our users happier. But we can't because we always deprioritize it because of how expensive it is.
Wow.
Does that answer your question, though?
And it does. And I think for me, it's amazing how there's no right or single way to go about all these things, that there are so many things that are contingent and also, but I tend to rely a lot on like simple theories, but, and at the same time, what motivates me a lot to go talk to people about these things is that they'll offer a perspective like yours, which is like, but it's much more layered than that. But I find this all be, certainly enlightening overall when it comes to the overall campaign. So Zach, we've come to the end of the questionings that we have. I want to give you an opportunity to share what you're up to at the latest. Really, the floor is yours. Go for it.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm right now working on an email series and ebook called Senior Mindset, where I'm kind of talking about the mindset of a true senior engineer. And it kind of came out of my frustration where I first got the title senior engineer and I thought I was crushing it. And then I got a performance review, and they were like, dude, you're an amazing programmer. You're the best engineer we have. But all the other stuff, you would probably be fired if you didn't have a relationship with the founders. I was like, what? How can you be both an amazing engineer and a terrible senior engineer at the same time? So I started digging into that, and kind of through the years wrote a bunch of essays about it. And now I've come up with an ebook on seniormindset.com that's like, what's the difference between someone who's an engineer, someone who has a senior engineer title, and then what takes you from being a senior engineer by title to being a true senior engineer, someone who actually gets all of the autonomy and responsibility that they're looking for.
Got it. And I mean, I'm almost wondering, like, what did you learn about yourself? But that's probably in your book as well. But what a horrible thing to receive in terms of performance review. Very confusing. But I hope that, like, this journey for you in terms of that self-reflection is the right kind of thing for your own personal growth, and hopefully can help other people grow as well. Swizec Teller, thank you so much for being on Educative Sessions, and really appreciated you sharing your incredible, story from where you started and where you're at right now. And I wish you nothing but the best success. I also want to thank everybody who's been watching or listening to this episode of Educative Sessions. You can check out more of our talks on YouTube or on Spotify or on any other major podcast application. And lastly, if you want to learn a little bit more about Educative, you can check us out at educative.io. So for all of us here at Educative, thank you so much and happy learning. Bye-bye now. Hi there. Hope you enjoyed this educative session. Be sure to check out more on YouTube or on any podcasting app. And be sure to like this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Happy learning.